The arrow doesn't kill him. That's the first thing to understand. The arrow splinter that takes his remaining eye at the siege of Rabi in 1421, the fragment that finds the gap between the helmet and the cheekbone and ends whatever light he had left, doesn't kill him. He staggers. His men catch him. They carry him back from the wall. Then he gets back up. He cannot see anything. Not light, not shapes, not the walls of the castle in front of him or the men standing at his shoulder or the battlefield that has been his entire world for 2 years. Everything is gone. He is 60 years old, standing in the middle of a war, completely blind. He starts asking questions. What is the terrain to the east? How many men does the enemy have on the northern approach? Where are the wagons positioned? His subordinates answer. He processes. He gives orders. The siege continues. This is who Jan Žižka is. Not the battles. He won all of them. Not the crusades. There were 5. And the army he built broke everyone. Not the Holy Roman Emperor who fled from him across a frozen river, with 12,000 of his men dead in the snow behind him. This moment. A blind man in his 60s on a battlefield in Bohemia, asking questions instead of calling for a surgeon, because for Jan Žižka, the loss of his eyes was not the end of anything. It was just the next problem to solve. The Holy Roman Emperor had already sent his armies into Bohemia, professional soldiers, knights. The full institutional weight of the Catholic Church pointed at one kingdom. All of them had gone home defeated, and the man who defeated them had just lost the last thing they hadn't already taken from him. He got deadlier every time they tried to break him. After Rabi, he won 6 more battles. He couldn't see a single one of them. The world that made him this way had been building toward a fire for 100 years before he was born. Not his fire, a different one. A fire in a cathedral square in the Swiss city of Constance in July 1415, where a Bohemian priest named Jan Hus burned at the stake for the crime of believing that ordinary people deserved access to God without paying the church for the privilege. Hus had been a theology professor in Prague, a careful man, a precise thinker, not a revolutionary by temperament. He spent years arguing that the Catholic Church had rotted from the inside, that priests who sold forgiveness were not serving God, that a Christian could read Scripture and form a direct relationship with the divine without clerical intermediaries extracting fees at every sacrament. These were not the ideas of a violent man. They were the opening paragraphs of an argument Martin Luther would finish a century later. But Hus made the argument in 1415. And in 1415, the institution he was criticizing still had enough power to make an example of him. The Council of Constance gave him a safe conduct, a written guarantee of protection to travel to Constance and defend his ideas in person. He came. They arrested him anyway, tried him, found him guilty, stripped his priestly vestments in a ceremony designed to maximize humiliation, placed a paper crown painted with demons on his head. Then they burned him. Safe conduct, it turned out, meant nothing when the church decided someone needed to die. In Bohemia, the news arrived like a spark in dry wood. Hus had not been just a theologian to the Bohemians. He had given voice to a frustration building for generations. The church in Bohemia was wealthy, visibly, obscenely wealthy. The clergy owned land, collected rents, accumulated gold, while the peasants who worked their land went hungry. Hus had named this plainly. When the church burned him for it, they did not extinguish the argument. They confirmed it. They demonstrated with fire that the institution he had criticized was exactly what he said it was. Within 4 years, Bohemia was at war. The man who would fight that war was already 59 years old when it began. He had spent his entire adult life being shaped for it without knowing it. Jan Žižka was born around 1360 in Trocnov, a small village in southern Bohemia, landed gentry but minor, the kind of family with status and without wealth. He lost his first eye young. The sources don't agree on how. Childhood accident, a fight, an early skirmish. What is recorded is the nickname it earned him. One-eyed Žižka. He wore it like a title. He spent years attached to the royal court, chamberlain to the queen, close enough to power to understand how it moved. He attended Hus's sermons. He absorbed what he heard. And alongside the theology, he spent decades learning the one other thing that survival in a medieval kingdom required: how to fight, as a mercenary, as a soldier in the low-level conflicts of Central European politics. He was skilled enough to find himself at the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, one of the largest engagements in medieval European history, the Polish-Lithuanian alliance breaking the Teutonic Knights on a field in Prussia, fighting on the winning side, watching how a massive cavalry force moved and breathed and could be destroyed. He was 50 years old, one eye. He filed everything he saw away. When the Hussite Revolution began in 1419, Žižka was not a young man making his name. He was an old man, applying everything he had accumulated. He looked at the men he had to work with, peasants, farmers, men who had never held a sword, owned no armor, had never been trained for anything except agricultural labor, men whose tools were threshing flails, hammers, farm carts. He did not see weakness. He saw material that hadn't been shaped yet. The system he built from that material was deceptively simple and tactically revolutionary. He took four-wheeled farm carts and reinforced their sides with planking angled outward to deflect arrows and blunt cavalry impact. He cut loopholes through which crossbowmen and handgunners could fire. He chained the carts together in formation, a mobile fortress that could be assembled on any ground in minutes, creating an interlocking defensive perimeter that armored cavalry could not easily breach. He mounted small cannons on select carts. He positioned infantry armed with modified flails, pikes, and halberds in the gaps between them. Then he worked out how to push the entire structure forward as a weapon. The chained column could move, could be driven into an enemy line. Military historians would note 5 centuries later that what Žižka built in the fields of Bohemia was the conceptual prototype of the tank, a vehicle designed not just to survive contact with the enemy, but to generate it on controlled terms. His enemies were knights, men whose entire military identity was built around the mounted charge, the personal duel, the shock of steel meeting steel in the open field. They had never faced anything like this. They had no framework for it. The first test came in March 1420, before the official crusade arrived. At a frozen pond near the village of Sudomiez, a royalist force of 2,000 cavalry intercepted Žižka, moving south with approximately 600 men. Farmers, minor nobility, anyone who had followed him out of Prague. No professional soldiers, no cavalry of their own. The ice was still thick enough to hold foot soldiers, but would not hold horses at full charge. Žižka knew this because he had asked. He positioned his carts at the edge of the ice, chained them, waited. The cavalry came, hit the chain. The horses that tried to push through found no purchase on the frozen surface, bunching against each other, presenting their flanks to the crossbowmen in the loopholes at point-blank range. What had looked like a slaughter, 2,000 professional horsemen against 600 farmers, turned into a killing ground. The cavalry that could not advance and could not retreat took casualties it had not been designed to absorb. They broke. 600 Bohemian peasants with farm carts watched 2,000 knights leave the field. Žižka packed up his carts and kept moving south. The first official anti-Hussite crusade arrived later that same year. King Sigismund of Hungary, Holy Roman Emperor, the man who had guaranteed Jan Hus's safe conduct and watched him burn, marched a professional army into Bohemia to end the rebellion. What he found at Witkov Hill outside Prague was Žižka on high ground, with a fortified position, and the patience of a man who had already figured out how this ended. The assault failed. Sigismund's cavalry broke against the position and bled into the hillside. The emperor withdrew. The first crusade was over. The second was already being assembled, and by the time it crossed into Bohemia, the commander waiting for it would not be able to see it coming. Stick around until the end, and subscribe if this is your kind of history. The Second Crusade arrived in 1421 with more men, and the conviction that last time had been an aberration. It wasn't, but something had changed on Žižka's side of the line. In the summer of 1421, at the siege of Raby Castle, a crossbow bolt struck a tree near the wall and sent a wooden splinter sideways into his remaining eye. One account specifies the fragment, wood, not metal, the kind of random physical detail that feels too small for what it caused. His men caught him as he staggered back from the wall. They moved him away from the fighting. He started asking questions before they finished setting him down. What is the enemy's position on the eastern approach? How many men visible on the wall? Where are the carts relative to the gatehouse? His subordinates answered. He processed. He gave orders. The siege continued. There is no recorded moment of collapse, no gap in command, while someone else stepped in. The interrogation of his officers began within minutes and did not stop. The blindness had not created a new problem. It had accelerated something already underway. The second eye's loss removed the last physical input. What remained was pure information, processed faster than anything on the other side of the field. The Hussite chronicler Wawrzynek Brzezové, who knew Žižka personally, who documented these wars from inside them, and whose account is among the most credible surviving records of the period, noted the effect of the blindness with a precision most later historians would miss. The blind general, he wrote, demanded terrain descriptions of a thoroughness that his opponents never matched. He knew the slope of every approach before he committed to it. He knew where the ground would favor the carts and where it would not. He knew, from the reports of scouts, he had trained to observe exactly what he needed to know, what his enemies were doing, before they knew what he was going to do about it. He had been good with one eye. He became something else without either. When Sigismund returned that autumn, he seized Kutna Hora, a wealthy silver mining city deep in Bohemia, one of the most strategically important urban centers in the kingdom. He had sympathizers inside the walls who opened the gates for his army before Žižka's relief force could reach them. The imperial army moved quickly, surrounding the Hussite force from within. Sigismund's combined numbers were somewhere around 50,000 men. Žižka's force, Taborites and Prague contingents together, was between 10 and 12,000, surrounded, 5-1, against a blind general. His officers came to him with the situation report. He listened to all of it: the enemy positions, the terrain on each approach, the condition of the roads leading out, the weight and mobility of each section of the chain. He asked questions they hadn't thought to answer yet: the gradient of the northern road, the width of the gap between Sigismund's cavalry on the eastern flank and the infantry holding the crossroads. His officers went back and looked and came back with numbers. He made his decision. He was not going to hold the position and wait to be destroyed in detail. He was not going to negotiate. He was going to pick the weakest point in a circle of 50,000 men and drive his entire formation through it. The column assembled in the pre-dawn dark, the chained carts moving into line, the cannon crews checking loads, the infantry filing into the gaps between the vehicles. Žižka stood at the front of it, with his hand on an officer's arm. His officers described what they could see. He told them what was about to happen, and in what order it would happen, and what each section of the column would do when the line made contact. Then he ordered it forward. The leading carts hit the imperial line before the cavalry on the flanks fully understood what was moving toward them. The cannons fired at point-blank range into the men directly in front of the column, not aimed at individuals, but at the density of the formation, at the packed mass of soldiers whose instinct was to hold ground rather than open a corridor for something they had never seen move this way before. The crossbowmen in the loopholes worked the flanks. The infantry in the gaps pushed through whatever the cannons had opened. The line broke. The column came through it like water through a crack in a dam. Not all at once, not cleanly, men fighting hand to hand in the spaces between the carts as the imperial cavalry tried to collapse the flanks back together. But the momentum was forward, and it stayed forward, and Žižka was at the front of it, receiving reports, adjusting the direction of the column in real time, based on descriptions of what the enemy was doing 40 yards ahead of the leading cart. Military historians would later identify this engagement as the first recorded mobile artillery maneuver in history. Not a defensive formation that happened to hold, not a siege, a deliberate offensive charge through a surrounding force 5 times the defending army's size, executed by a man who could not see any of it. He retreated to Kolín, received reinforcements, turned around. At Nebovidi in January 1422, he found what remained of Sigismund's army and destroyed it. 12,000 imperial casualties. The emperor fled across a frozen river, barely ahead of the pursuit, his second crusade collapsing behind him in the snow. The emperor, who had outlasted Hus by 9 years, who had sent 2 armies into Bohemia and lost both, fled through the winter dark from a blind man in his 60s, commanding farmers with carts. The Third Crusade dissolved before it reached him. Word that Žižka was marching was enough. The crusading force disintegrated on the road without contact. The reputation of what had happened at Kutna Hora and Nebovidi, doing the work that the army didn't have to. The Fourth and Fifth Crusades were still coming. He would not live to see either of them. But the army he built would, and they would run from it the same way. The army he built was not one thing. The movement behind it had never been one thing. What gathered around Jan Hus's memory was a coalition held together by shared necessity, the common enemy outside the walls more dangerous than the disagreements inside them. The Utrechists were the moderates, the educated urban class, the men who wanted reform negotiated through existing structures. The Taborites were Žižka's people, radical, rural, uncompromising, the faction that had done the most fighting and held the least patience for half measures. While Sigismund kept sending crusades, the coalition held. The external pressure was strong enough to suppress what lay beneath it. After the Third Crusade dissolved without contact, that pressure temporarily ran out of armies to send. What lay beneath surfaced immediately. By 1423, the Hussites were fighting each other across the same Bohemian countryside they had spent 3 years defending together. The fractures were theological, political, and deeply personal. Years of shared sacrifice producing not solidarity, but a specific kind of bitterness that only emerges between people who believe they are on the same side and have concluded the other faction has betrayed what that means. The Utrechists wanted a settlement. The Taborites wanted a reckoning. Between those two positions, there was no middle ground that either side could stand on without feeling they had surrendered something essential. Žižka chose. He fought the Utrechists at Hořice in April 1423. Won. Fought them again at Strakov in August. Won again. Both engagements were tactically clean, his formation moving with the same precision it had applied to every crusade before this. The terrain was Bohemian, familiar, and Žižka's subordinates knew how to describe it to him. His opponents knew his tactics in the abstract, because they had watched him use them. For 3 years, knowing them and stopping them were different problems, but the victories left a residue that military success alone could not wash off. After Strakov, Žižka's troops killed survivors contrary to his explicit orders. Whether this was rage or exhaustion or something that had been building in men who had fought for years without adequate rest is not recorded. What is recorded is Žižka's response. He commanded them to repent, to pray for forgiveness. He understood precisely what they had done, and he required them to acknowledge it before God. Vavřinec Březové recorded this moment with the careful neutrality of a man who had spent years documenting things he did not entirely know how to process. The blind general who had never lost ordered his men to pray for killing Bohemians. Then he organized them back into formation and continued the campaign against the Bohemians he had not yet fought. Both of those things were true simultaneously. The decisive engagement came at Malešov in June 1424. The Utrequist force was substantial, not an improvised levy, but a proper army, commanded by men who had studied what Žižka did and had specific answers prepared for it. They understood the wagon system. Their commanders had watched it operate at close range and spent months working out how to neutralize it. They came to Malešov with that preparation and with the confidence that this time they were not facing an army of crusaders who had never seen carts used this way. What they had not accounted for was the hill. Žižka's subordinates had spent days before the engagement mapping the terrain around Malešov in detail. The gradient of every approach, the drainage of every field, the specific geography of a slope on the eastern edge of the battlefield that would do something to a wagon column moving downhill that no infantry formation could replicate. His officers described it to him. He asked questions about the angle and the width and the condition of the ground at the bottom. He wanted to know what an infantry line at the base of that slope would look like from a column moving down it at speed. His officers answered. He built the engagement around that slope. The wagon column that came down the eastern hill at Malešov was not moving at the careful tactical pace of a defensive formation being walked into position. It was moving fast, carts unchained, rolling on the gradient, using the hill's own geometry as the weapon, rather than the cannon in the loopholes, or the crossbowmen at the sides. The weight of the formation coming downhill at the Utrequist line compressed everything: the timing, the space to maneuver, the window to respond to something that looked like chaos but was moving exactly where Žižka had decided it would move. The Utrequist line broke under it. After Malešov, there was no Hussite faction with enough remaining strength to continue the civil war. The moderate leaders came to Žižka not with demands but with a request: lead us again. He agreed, not because he had forgiven them, because the war was not finished and a unified army was more useful than a principled one. A new campaign was organized. The unified Hussite leadership decided to carry the fight into Sigismund's own territory, into Hungary, onto the emperor's ground, taking the doctrine that had broken every crusade into the land where those crusades had been assembled. Žižka was given command in the autumn of 1424. He was 63 years old, completely blind, had not lost a battle in 5 years of continuous warfare, had just fought a civil war within the revolution he had been defending and won that too, had codified his military methods into 12 written principles, precise enough that any competent commander could study and apply them. He was, by any measure available to the medieval world, the most dangerous general alive. He began the campaign, and the army moved east toward the Moravian border. Then something happened that no wagon formation could stop. The plague does not negotiate. It does not respond to terrain or information, or the relentless precision of a mind that had converted every physical loss into a tactical advantage. It arrived in Žižka's camp somewhere on the road near Přibyslav in early October, 1424, the way it arrived everywhere, without announcement, without observable cause, without any mechanism that the medicine of the 15th century could identify or interrupt. Men in the army began dying, then more men, then officers, then Žižka. His body could not process this particular problem into a solution. There were no subordinates who could describe the terrain of what was happening to him. No formation to adjust, no gradient to exploit. The battlefield was internal, and he had no instruments for it. Vavřinec recorded what followed with a brevity that feels deliberate. A chronicler who had spent years writing thousands of words about Žižka's campaigns, finding only a few sentences for this. The general fell ill, the army halted. The campaign that was going to carry the war into Hungary stopped on a road still in Bohemia. His officers gathered around him. The men who had been his eyes for 3 years sat with a commander who was asking different questions now. Questions they had no instruments to answer. He died on October 11th, 1424, at Přibyslav, still in the field, still officially in command of an army that had nowhere to march without him. The campaign into Hungary was over. The war was not over. The cause was not over. The doctrine was not over. But the man was gone. His followers came together in the aftermath and named themselves, not for the victories, not for the tactics, not for the broken crusades, or the fled emperor, or the armies that had turned back rather than face him. They named themselves for the absence, the orphans. The quote that spread through Bohemia and into the imperial courts arrived without a named source, repeated by enough chroniclers across enough years that it acquired the weight of received truth. The one whom no mortal hand could destroy was extinguished by the finger of God. The men who had sent 5 crusades into Bohemia and watched all 5 come back broken understood what this meant. They had never beaten him, not once, not close. The only force that had managed what none of that could was a disease that killed everyone the same way, regardless of what they had earned. They had not defeated him, they had outlasted him. And the Hussite armies that had just buried the most dangerous general in Europe were now marching back to Bohemia without him, carrying the 12 written principles, the formations, the doctrine, everything he had built from nothing and refined through every loss they had given him. The question was whether it could survive without the mind that had made it work. Prokop the Bold did not try to replace Žižka. He was too intelligent for that. The general who inherited command of the Hussite cause after October 1424 understood that what Žižka had been was not a role that could be filled by appointment. It was the product of a specific life, an accumulation of loss and adaptation and tactical refinement that had taken 60 years to produce and could not be replicated on short notice or any other notice. What Prokop could do was carry the system forward, apply the doctrine, keep the wagon formations moving, and the crusades broken, and the cause alive long enough for the political situation to shift into something the Hussites could survive. He was good at it, better than good. In the years after Žižka's death, Prokop drove the war further than Žižka had ever taken it, raiding deep into Germany, into Silesia, into Austria, carrying the fight onto enemy ground rather than waiting for the empire to come to Bohemia. The Hussite armies under Prokop ranged across Central Europe with a reach that would have been unimaginable in 1419, when Žižka had 600 farmers on a frozen pond. They were not winning converts. They were demonstrating, with fire and systematic destruction, that the cost of continuing the war against Bohemia was higher than any crusading power had calculated when they started it. The Fourth Crusade penetrated deeper than any before it, and was destroyed at Aussig in 1426. The fifth, the largest, the church had ever assembled against Bohemia, somewhere between 70 and 100,000 men, heard the Hussite army singing their war hymn from across a hill in 1431 and ran, not retreated, ran, before a single cart was visible, before a single cannon was primed. Soldiers in full flight from the sound of what was coming, from the accumulated weight of every battle, every broken crusade, every army that had gone home defeated. The event entered the military record as the Hussite wagon fright. Žižka had been dead for 7 years. His army still scattered crusades without fighting them. For 10 years after Žižka's death, the crusading powers were still losing to an army he had built and a doctrine he had written down before he died. The system outlasted the man because the man had understood that it needed to. The principles were not a memorial. They were an instruction set. Žižka had codified his methods precisely because he understood that the blindness that had made him systematize everything also meant the system had to exist independently of his ability to transmit it in person. He had made himself replaceable on purpose. The downstream consequences of what he built ran further than Bohemia and longer than the 15th century. John Hunyadi of Hungary, the general who would become the dominant military figure of the mid-15th century, the man who stopped Ottoman expansion into Central Europe through the 1440s and won the relief of Belgrade. In 1456, studied Hussite tactics firsthand when Sigismund brought him to Bohemia in the 1430s. He absorbed the wagon system and rebuilt his own army around a version of it. The war wagons with cannon and crossbowmen that Hunyadi deployed against the Ottomans at the battles of Varna and Belgrade were direct descendants of the carts Žižka had chained together on Bohemian farmland 3 decades earlier. The Ottomans, after losing repeatedly to Hungarian wagon tactics, studied what was beating them and adopted it. They called it Tabur Jangi. They used it at Otlukbeli in 1473 and at Chaldiran in 1514 against the Safavids. The Safavids reformed their army after Chaldiran and deployed their own version at the Battle of Jam in 1528. A tactical doctrine invented by a one-eyed Bohemian peasant general in his 50s, refined after he lost the other eye, had travelled from Bohemia into Hungary, through the Ottoman Empire and into Persia across a century of warfare, carried in the minds of commanders who had never heard his name, applied in landscapes he had never seen, winning battles in languages he had never spoken. The tank that appeared on the battlefields of the First World War in 1916, the armoured vehicle designed to cross contested ground under fire and break entrenched positions, was not invented by the men who built it. The conceptual lineage ran back through 5 centuries of mobile fortified warfare to a farm cart on a frozen pond in Bohemia in 1420. Military historians have noted this connection without quite knowing what to do with it. It sits in the margins of armor warfare history, acknowledged and then moved past, because the implications of it are slightly too large to sit there comfortably. But the system Prokop inherited could not do the one thing Žižka had always done. Žižka had won the civil wars. He had beaten the Utraquists at Hořice and Strachov and Malešov because he could read the fractures in the coalition as clearly as he read a battlefield, could see through the information his subordinates fed him, where the weakness was and how to drive something through it before it closed. Prokop was a battlefield commander. He was not a political one. He could win engagements. He could not hold together a movement whose internal disagreements had been suppressed rather than resolved. The Utraquists waited. In 1434, they made their decision. They approached Sigismund, made terms, agreed to a settlement that gave them the moderate religious reforms they had been seeking since 1419 in exchange for their military cooperation against the radical Taborites, against Prokop, against the faction that had done most of the fighting and received the least of the reward. The combined force that met the Taborites at the Battle of Lipany on May 30th, 1434 was not a crusade. It was a coalition army that included men who had fought alongside the Taborites for 15 years. They knew exactly how the wagon formations worked because they had watched them work from the inside. Prokop was killed. The Taborites were massacred. The radical Hussite cause that Žižka had built from nothing and carried through every crusade and a civil war and everything Sigismund had thrown at it for 15 years ended on a Bohemian field at the hands of former allies who had finally calculated that peace with the empire was more achievable than victory with the radicals. The Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Emperor did not defeat the Hussites in battle. They won by splitting them, by finding the fractures that Žižka had papered over with victories and waiting for him to be gone long enough that no one could paper them over anymore. And yet, at the Council of Basel in 1436, the Church recognized modified versions of the 4 Articles of Prague, the religious demands the Hussites had been making since 1419: freedom of religion, the right to preach, restrictions on clerical wealth and political power, the right to take communion in both forms, the specific liturgical demand that had started all of it, the thing Jan Hus had argued for before they put the demon crown on his head and lit the fire. The church that had burned Hus for making the argument was now encoding his argument into church law. Sigismund, who had guaranteed Hus's safe conduct, watched him burn, launched 5 crusades, fled across a frozen river in the dark, finally became King of Bohemia in 1436. He had been trying to take the throne since 1419. He had spent 17 years and 5 armies and the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers reaching a city that had been his inheritance. He ruled it for 11 months. He died in December 1437. The king who had outlasted Žižka by 13 years had his throne for less than a year. The man who had fled from the blind general at Nebovidi, who had assembled the full military power of the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic Church and sent it into Bohemia again and again, died in possession of a kingdom whose religious character had been permanently shaped by the man he could never defeat on a battlefield. Jan Žižka's statue stands on Witkov Hill in Prague today, the hill where he positioned his wagons against the First Crusade in 1420 and sent Sigismund's cavalry back down the slope. It is one of the largest equestrian bronze statues in the world. He faces outward over the city in full armor, mace raised, with the bearing of a man who has made a decision and is in the process of enforcing it. The statue does not depict what he could not see. It does not mention the arrow at Rabi, or the eye lost before that, or the 60 years of accumulated loss that produced the commander on that hill. It shows a man in the posture of someone who cannot be stopped. That posture is accurate. What the statue cannot show, what no monument can show, is the specific quality that made the posture true. Not physical strength or military genius in the abstract. The capacity to receive a loss, any loss, and convert it immediately into the next working variable. The eye gone in youth, compensation forced, vision replaced by method. The eye gone at Rabi, method fully systematized. The last physical input replaced by something more precise. The peasant army with no weapons, weapons invented from what was in their hands. Every army they sent, the system refined against each one. Each time they broke something they assumed was essential, he came back with the problem solved and a new capability they hadn't seen before. The church that burned Jan Hus in 1415 intended to silence an argument by destroying the man making it. What they did instead was confirm the argument to everyone watching, radicalize the population that confirmation reached, and channel that radicalization through a man who had spent 50 years accumulating every skill the resulting war would require. The burning made the army. The army produced the doctrine. The doctrine spread across 3 empires and 5 centuries, and is still traceable in the mechanical lineage of armored warfare today. They could not have done more damage to their own cause if they had tried. This is the question that Žižka's life keeps asking, the one that has no comfortable answer. He won every battle. The cause he fought for was partially defeated after he died. The demands he bled for were eventually conceded, but by negotiation, not victory, and at the cost of the radical faction he led being massacred by the people he had also defended. He built a system that outlasted him and spread further than he could have imagined. He did not live to see any of it. Was it enough? The answer depends on what you think winning means. The radical cause did not survive intact. The argument Jan Hus burned for became permanent law. The system he built changed the shape of warfare across a century and 3 empires. Whether that adds up to enough depends entirely on which of those things you think he was fighting for. He could not see the battlefield at Witkov Hill. He could not see the encirclement at Kutna Hora, or the slope at Malashov, or the column of his wagons breaking through 50,000 men in the pre-dawn dark. He could not see the 5th Crusade running from a song on a hillside, He could not see any of the things that his name is attached to in every military history that mentions him. His enemies could see all of it. They could see the wagons and the peasants and the aging blind man with his hand on an officer's arm. They had every physical advantage. They had professional cavalry and imperial resources and the full institutional authority of the church behind them. He got deadlier every time they tried. The finger of God, when it finally came, used a plague, because nothing else had worked. And even then, it waited until he was 63 years old, still in the field, still undefeated, still moving toward the next campaign on a road that ran east toward an enemy who had not yet understood what was coming for them. The one whom no mortal hand could destroy. He never lost a battle. They never found a way to give him one. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. An army ran from a song, from the memory of what that army had done to every force before them. What does it say about what he built that his reputation alone was enough? Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories like this one.